So the discussion at the same time as they raised their cackles about participating in the project, which they eventually did. And I will say that I'm sure that the state intervened and assured them that they were going to be fine and nobody's going to seize their cannon, although I'm told that during the reenactment there was some issue about permits for some of the cannon in the reenactment, but I'll leave that to those who know more about that than I. But I think what was going on was separating the cannons from the munitions, and that's what happened around black powder in Massachusetts. Indeed, a story of the reenactment was captured in one of a series of monographs that the Bicentennial Commission authored. I have the ones here, and I actually visited with the reenactment, and this was my photograph that they put in the book. They misspelled my name, but I was very pleased. 50 years later, I didn't realize that they had done this, that they had used my photo. This was Ed McColgan, who was the executive director. He was a state rep from southern Hampshire County. You may know his name. He became a farmer in Cummington. I think he tolerated me. I never got much of a warm feeling from Ed, frankly. Don't really know why. I think it may have been that I was so new to producing that I showed them some of the images and they said, well, where's the story? I said, well, that's coming. I think I kind of jumped the gun. I showed them images with Allman Brothers music. And I remember looking at me, what are you doing? And I said, well, wait a minute. And then I engaged them, but I didn't first present them with what we call a treatment to lay out the plan for the production. This is a guy who I also photographed having a Big Mac and wrote a story for the Real Paper, which was kind of a progressive tabloid publishing Cambridge at the time. And I was happy to see that my photographs ended up being used. So let's see, this is Longfellow House, which is where Washington was headquartered. That was a picture of mine. That was a picture of mine from out here. And I made it to this Massachusetts brochure. That's my photograph from one of the April 19th parades. And thank you, Rob, for taking some images from the video and creating this poster, which now becomes part of the canon, if you will, of my history with Hank, with Henry Knox. But I spent the night in Westfield. The Fullers, the home that you saw in the show, is a kind of replica home. It may have been a tavern at one time, I don't know. But I woke up in the morning to the sunrise, and that was the bed that they let me sleep in, et cetera, et cetera. I had topo maps that I traveled with. And I should tell you, I traveled the dates that Knox traveled 199 years later. I really did do that. I really was at Ticonderoga before sunrise when he was there, and I found the old Bay Path. I walked up a hill in Westfield, and sure enough, it was very much ghost-like. And I remember, and it's sort of funny that the things that I remember, but I remember standing there. There were a series of suburban homes, maybe 50, 75 yards to the south of where I was. But I was in the woods, and I looked and I said, oh my God, this is the road. And it really was ghost-like. I believe that that's the beginning of the Devil's Staircase. And I never quite captured the incline, and maybe in the 200 years, I walked up a different route to get to the old Bay Path. This was the view from up there when I went up that day. For the bicentennial, the commission did a puppet show. Okay. So they actually reached out to schools. Hubli Grigi Puppet Theater did a show telling the story of the Knox Trail, and they staged it for me, and I brought in the kids. And I did weird things when I was traveling, because one of the things that I learned as I began the work was that there was something going on between Eastern Mass and Western Mass. Or I should say between Western Mass and Eastern Mass. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that contemporary sequence in a moment. But I did silly things, like I wanted to be at sunrise at a marsh, at a swamp. See the beaver hut? Little did I know, 50 years later, on our property, we have a 50-acre property in Conway, I'm dealing with beaver like you wouldn't believe. But I wanted to be there at sunrise. I didn't use the show, these images in the show. And this is a guy, Charlie Merrick. Why I remember their names, I don't know, but I remember Charlie's name. And he was being squeezed. This is in Wilbraham. Part of that sequence, the contemporary sequence, is the only part of the revitalization, a few people that I showed it to before I kind of released it for others to see, that garnered comment and criticism. Some people who saw it said, drop it. Other people said, shorten it. Now, this is a very small group of people, of colleagues to whom I showed it. Shorten it. Well, indeed, I took a minute out of it. I cut a minute out of Les McCann music to shorten it a bit. But at the time, and the state agreed, that it was important to show contrasts, historical similarities, the cultural life of Massachusetts. It was kind of a Chamber of Commerce-y kind of sequence that had a lot of the meanings attached to it, not the least of which were the people that I photographed, and the sort of commonality of purpose and the fun that people were having along. These were all Knox Trail towns. I could tell you, I went to Shrewsbury, went to Leicester. I mean, every single town is somehow, the waterfall in Natick, they're all somehow included. And the idea being that if they showed the show in those communities, did you see Monterey?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I went to find the markers. I didn't even think to use this image because you can't tell that it's a Knox Trail marker. You don't see the bronze. Not because of the guy's long hair, which at the time I did not have. I'd already cut it. But I went to a powwow. And the day of the powwow, I think it was in Great Barrington or Sheffield, and it was raining and it was indoor. Photographically, it was nothing of value to me because it was in a school gym or something like that. But I had captured this little boy, and I didn't use it because I never quite understood what was on his mind. You know, you saw what's his name, Malcolm Hanna, the guy doing the webbing on the chair. And his expression, well, you can read something into it. I can't read into his expression. Are you in the room? This is Monterey. There's a little girl who saw me on the road. She came up the hill. She sat down with her bicycle and sat there. The picture that's in the show is of her. Anybody know who this is? Are you in the room? The project had challenges then, and the project had challenges now. And I want to get to our Q&A, and we're going to do it in just a couple of minutes. This is a Tisdale portrait the Museum of Fine Arts has. That portrait is 2 inches by 3 inches. It's done after the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of Henry Knox that we used at the conclusion of the show. But I was confronted, I couldn't use lights. And I knew going into it that literally the thing is this big. To be able to get this image out of it, what it took. That was a real technical, photographic challenge to be able to get into something that small. Our big issue on this project was around color correction. And I'm just going to share this with you very quickly because it was part of the expense of being able to show you a show. But it was a really rude surprise to me. I went to the state archives. At one point I purged files because we were paper, up until, the 90s. I had so much paper, we were buried in paper. I don't know what happened to my Knox file. So I went to the state archives and they had a file in the Mass Bicentennial slideshow and there was my script with my markings on it. So that's why I had a script. I wouldn't otherwise have had a script. But I couldn't find the originals. I don't know why I didn't retain the originals, because I think it was my responsibility to make multiple dupes of the show. All I had was a duplicate set. The duplicate set had been in the dark. I probably showed it once or twice, but it aged. I had the duplicate set of slides after we got together, and I had them digitized, and this is what I got. Totally unacceptable. So then we used a very simple AI program to try to color correct, which was also not acceptable. And then we did more color work, and this is in Photoshop and very sophisticated tools, and we ended up with this as our balance. But we had to balance images in the show with originals. So notice the difference in his coat color and his skin tones from one to the other. So that was the ultimate challenge, and it was very difficult because we wanted to integrate new images that I hadn't. 2 trays, 280 slides, that's it. And that whole script, right? I wanted to add more images. Well, the only way to add more images, well, I had them. I kept everything that I didn't use in the show. How do you mix the color? That was the challenge. This is Rick Degree. This is the studio, his studio in Northampton, where we did the job. You can see on the top left baseball. He's done some editing with Ken Burns, among others. He began his career producing editing with Florentine Films, which is Ken Burns. And then this is my little huddle in my downsized studio. But you see those 18 boxes of slides, each of which holds 600 plus slides? That was my Henry Knox collection. So I bemoaned to you earlier about the horror of handling slides. That light table is half the size of what I used to use. It used to hold 750 slides. I cut it in half when I downsized my studio. But this is where the project happened. So again, those were some of the challenges to getting us to where we are now. One other, Tony Khan, the narrator, whose voice you may have recognized. He was the host of The World on NPR. He did a lot of television work in the Boston area, Channel 5. He did American Experience voiceovers. He's a writer. Interestingly, his father was blacklisted in Hollywood, so that's a whole part of Tony Khan's history. He's a writer and producer himself. But Tony is now 80 years old, and we wanted to add a paragraph. Why in the original show we didn't talk about what preceded the evacuation? I don't have any explanation why the people supervising the script and development didn't say, hey, you're ignoring the moment that those cannon are on Dorchester Heights. So we added a few sentences, and Rob helped me with the content to shape those few sentences, but Tony is 80 years old. We used an AI program in audio to synthesize, captured his voice, sampled his voice, and gave us a read in the 21st century. That's yet another challenge. So, why did I get the job? It was my second sort of commercial project. The first was with a group called Boston Educational Research. You may know the name Pleasant T. Rowland. She was an elementary school teacher who really believed in children's literature, and I was doing work with them at Lippincott and Addison Wellesley. Film strips were the media of the time. You probably remember film strips, right? Pleasant went on to found the American Girl collection that she sold for $700 million to Mattel. That was my first commercial client, so this was sort of my second commercial job. But I knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy. That's how I got the job. When I was a grad student, I had a graduate assistantship. I ran a couple of auditoria at Boston University. I did a one-year master's in educational media. John Silver, whose name you may know, addressed students for the first time. I adjusted his microphone, and there was a TV reporter who approached me afterwards. What'd you think? I shared my opinion of John Silver's greeting to the student body. He was the most arrogant guy you'd ever meet in your life. Well, Jack Gordon became a fast friend. In fact, a couple years ago, we were buddies for 50 years. Jack introduced me to the PR at Polaroid, thinking, okay, this is a guy, somebody like me should meet, who knew Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins was the Senate president of the Bicentennial Commission. He was state senator from Concord. I was handed to the Bicentennial Commission. Here's the guy, and that's how the show came about. And that's YEB. Now, part of the challenge in the early 70s was shooting film. Well, what does that mean? Well, On the one hand, it's expensive. Shooting chromes, it's unforgiving. Whatever you shoot is what you get. So every shot you take, and it's all manual focus, right? You bracket the exposures, which is why I have that library of 18 boxes of slides. Those are all the images we didn't use. No zoom lenses. Zooms weren't around until sometime later in the 80s. So the complication of shooting film was one thing. To shoot the recreation, I was wearing 2 or 3 cameras. I also, by the way, had a little badge that I made, Bicentennial Commission, so people knew who I was when I was taking pictures various places. I also had a little VW square back. We didn't have air conditioning in the cars in '73, right? So I carried film in a little refrigerator pack, deathly afraid of it getting too hot, deathly afraid of it getting cold, because it would change the chemistry of the film. And I'd keep it on the front seat, and I would take it out with me. I mean, we literally, all of us, same thing with videotape. When you go through airport security, what do you do with videotapes? What do you do with these digital files? We're all worried to death that things are going to happen, you know, when we go through the screeners. Well, the same thing with film. You had to protect the film until it was processed and came back. I also, when I shot the Fuller's home at night, it was like 10 below. You wouldn't know that, but it really was. And I went inside and photographed the fireplace, and I destroyed the shutter on the camera. Luckily, I had, you know, I had multiple cameras, but that's a little taste, to say nothing of the anxiety of shooting generally. Well, how wonderful now, it's like you get an instant Polaroid, you can see your picture right away. Well, we didn't, so it was like a prayer, and I remember dropping off the film and waiting for it to come back and looking in the car, did I get it, did I get it, did I get it? And every shooter in the shooting film had the same, you know, the same anxieties about shooting film chromes. I gotta tell you that the experience, the bicentennial, you said it earlier, everybody was into it. And everywhere I went, doors opened. I wanted to be at Ticonderoga at sunrise. They put me up the night before, and they took me in at sunrise, before sunrise. The Fullers let me sleep in their home. People in Leicester, the Feinmans, put me up. Chagin put me up. When I went to the Big E, you know, the Big E and the big parking lots, there's one that's a VIP lot. I drove up slowly, and the cop was standing. I said, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. He saw my equipment, and I parked in the VIP lot. It was that kind of, you know, interest in the work and belief in who we are that made it possible. I didn't get releases from anyone, which is kind of an issue generally, from photographic releases from the people, but everybody knew I was there. The rule of thumb for me at the time was you never shoot unless they know you're doing it. They basically give you permission to do it. So I'm fine with all the people that I photographed, but nobody turned me down. And I would drive along, and I saw Malcolm Hanna doing his work, and he welcomed me and let me photograph him. The maple sugaring is in Ashfield, next town to Conway, where I live. McColgan knew the guy, and he welcomed me to come and photograph his maple sugaring operation. So that's just a little taste. And the one last anecdote, the Les McCann piece, I don't know why I knew it. It was recorded live in Switzerland at Montreux, the Montreux Jazz Festival. And Les McCann was performing in Boston on Boylston Street. I think it was Club 47, Jazz Club. And I oddly remember calling and getting his manager and explaining who I was and what I was doing, and could I have permission to use Cochise, that piece of music. And I heard Les McCann in the background say, oh, sure. That's the kind of cooperation. I worked directly with Harriet Ropes Cabot. Harriet Ropes Cabot, Bostonian Society, Faneuil Hall. She was the maitre d'. It was her collection. It was, you know, she was the historian at the time that everybody knew. And similarly at American Antiquarian, etc., everybody was into the project. There was this spirit of the bicentennial, and it was literally across the board. So, the last thing I want to tell you is everybody who appeared in here was a volunteer. The musicians, the voiceover talent, the people in the recreation. I think that the horse and oxen came from Sturbridge. I think the horse teams came from Cummington or Chester, one of the two. I can't remember which. Again, I don't have my files. They may have gotten expenses reimbursed, but nobody was paid. It was all volunteer. So that being said, I think I've gone on a little longer than I wanted, but I really want to hear your questions about the production, your questions about Knox, your questions about me, etc. So I leave it to you, and when we're done, I have a little treat for you at the end. Are there questions? Yes?
Over 40 days, there were no loyalists who noticed these cannons going through their town?
Well, that's a really good question.
Or did the British know they were coming but were unable to do anything about it?
I think the assumption is that nobody did anything about it. You know, you couldn't pick up a phone and make a phone call. And there were loyalists who were aware of what was going on because it was a parade. You know, they came through these towns and it was a parade. But no, there's no evidence that the word got to the British that this was happening. Tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah.
Well, Eric had his hand up first.
A terrific slideshow, really enjoyable, and very lovely of you.
And you know, today we'd shoot a video. We wouldn't shoot slides, right?
So, and very lovely of you to mention Mimi McDonald, who was indeed and her family. It was wonderful.
I got to know them all very, very well.
So my question is about those reenactors going through the snow and the woods there. Was that part of the reenactment?
No.
20th?
No. It was January 3, 4, 5 of 75 that we shot that. Oddly enough, I have my calendar from those years. I don't know if it was 1 or 2 days shoot. I don't remember. Jug End at the time was a 16-acre property.
So was that Jug End?
Appalachian Trail goes through that property, and it had everything that we needed. It had the brooks, it had the streams, it had the vistas, it had the trails, it had everything that we needed. So all of that took place at Jug End. Yeah.
This might be a better question for Rob, but you were recreating to a certain point. But one of the things I've always wondered is you always hear about the 120,000 pounds, recently corrected to 119,000 pounds of cannon. But what about all the carriage? The carriages must have added considerable weight and sleds to the whole train.
So the question for the camera is the cannons weighed 119,000 pounds, rounded up to 60 tons. What about the carriages and all that? The answer is they didn't bring the carriages. They just brought the barrels, the cannons. Knox realized carrying the wheels, and I mean they did carry some wheels, but basically the carriages for the cannons they didn't carry. They had those made when they got to Boston.
You have a number of images of Native Americans in the video. Who volunteered for that? Were they actually Native Americans?
Oh, yeah.
And were they part of the Stockbridge Muncie community or from other?
I don't know.
So the question is, they're Native Americans in the film. Were they Native Americans, and were they of the Stockbridge Muncie community?
I can only assume they were Mimi's contacts. And I'll remember when they came up bareback on their horses and they joined us in the recreation. She was that connected, and she really embraced the indigenous community of Southern Berkshire. That's why I was invited to the powwow. That's why these guys joined us on the recreation. So I can't answer where they came from, but they were local. Yes?
So, how long did it take?
Little louder, please.
How long did it take them to go from New York to Boston.
40 days.
Wow, that's a long time. A little.
And you
over,
know,
a little over a month.
like you, I live in Western Mass, and I know how cold it gets here at night. I can't imagine what they did at night. I can't begin to imagine. Maybe that's where all the beaver went that were decimated by the white man. But, you know, I just, the hardiness of the people who are transporting is just beyond imagination. And that's partly what we tried to capture. You know, you might be interested, well, were they actors? No, none of them were actors. Well, all that I said to the people in the recreation was, don't look at the camera. This is an encounter session. Everything you do from the moment, from the moment we get going until the moment we stop, you're on camera. Don't look at the camera. And my sound man had a little stereo microphone rig on his head. It was a couple of times we hear the woods. I think that's magic in audio recording. That's why we were able to gather that. But all the dialogue, it wasn't rehearsed. It was the real thing. We knew they had to rope to trees, we knew we had a hill that we could shoot it. But all of that dialogue was what was happening because they were recreating for us what it was like. And they were cold. And we lit that fire and they warmed their hands. I mean, it was a tough shoot, I will tell you that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, you can go. Question I've had since last night is this. He hired teamsters, he had 80 yoke of oxen, 160 oxen, and so on and so forth. And I was thinking, first of all, it must have been an enormously expensive project. And his personal wealth, I don't know what that was, his wife just disinherited. But even beyond that, he would have had to bring the money in order to hire all those people, which I imagine would have been mostly gold. And I'm thinking, first of all, how did he bring all that money? And secondly, how did he protect that money, because such an enormous amount of money? And I suspect that some of the people who were with him might not have been especially honest. And this is a whole aspect of it that I've been wondering about ever since last night. Do you have any information about that?
Well,
And by the
looking
way,
now
that's a
at the
terrific
image that
site.
we show of Blandford, you can see into his seat.
Uh-huh.
But that's a research question that I can't answer.
So let me just, for the camera, repeat the essence of the question. It was a huge logistical effort, but the question is, where did the money come from, and how did he carry the money and to pay the teamsters and the provisions and so on? Is that the essence of the question?
Yeah,
so I can try to answer a little bit of that. General Washington, when he authorized Henry Knox to take this expedition, gave him a letter of, I don't know what it's called, a letter of card or something like that, that says he's authorized to do this. And he sent a letter to the Continental Congress asking that Henry Knox that they appropriate money to reimburse Henry Knox for his expenses. That's my understanding. It cost a couple of £1,000 to do this. He tallied up his expenses. My understanding, and I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think I've read that they didn't give him money. They said he'll get reimbursed, and I believe it took about a year for him to be reimbursed. So he fronted the money. Interestingly enough, and it's mentioned in Jonathan's documentary that Henry had married Lucy Flucker, who was the daughter of the third-ranking royal officer in Massachusetts and very wealthy.
Who disowned her.
So
that's a technical term, disowned.
He got money through his wife. Ironically, of course, they were loyalists. They were royal. They were royal representatives. And again, it's ironic to me when evacuation day happened, Lucy Flucker's parents and sisters got on the boat and went back to England and never came back. So she inherited all of his land and all of his money. So it's kind of ironic. The Flucker money helped to finance their removal. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's my
It's more the question of that, even though he was reimbursed, he still would have had to bring the money there in order to pay, because I can't imagine the Teamsters would say, yeah.
So
we do with an
he
eye.
obviously had money to
Yeah.
pay people, and he kept track of it.
Mhm.
And how he secured that, I think there was some militia that went along to help with this. So I think there was a question there.
I was wondering what role women played in the bringing the cannons from Ticonderoga down. Would they travel with them? Did they pay local women? I mean, somebody had to. I'm sure women had to play some role.
So I only heard part of the question was who traveled with them?
No. What
women have
role
a
did
direct
women play in
Okay.
the Knox Trail?
I've not seen any records that there were women along, but it was not uncommon for there to be so-called camp followers who would go along and help with some of the cooking and mending and those kinds of things on military expeditions. So I haven't seen anything about that, but it would be plausible that there were.
That's why I suspect Ursula's read at the end of the show is something we introduced so that there was a woman's voice to be heard.
I'm curious for both of you in terms of putting together the documentary and in the historical research that you've done, what was the biggest surprise?
So the question is, what kind of research was done for the documentary? Is that?
No,
Well,
what's
no,
the
just-
biggest
Oh,
surprise?
what was the
biggest
biggest surprise?
surprise.
Okay, sorry.
Well, for me, he was a smart guy. And he sold me when, he was a co-host and he says, my insignificance, he sold me, his ardor for his wife, he sold me with that quote at the end, that he was a humanist. I mean, he was a deep thinker. And I think he recognized the horror of war. He saw the horror of war and he realized his hand in that. Sadly, he died at 56. He retired to Thomaston, Maine. He died choking on a chicken bone. He, I guess, had some kind of infection as a result of choking. But I think, he was a humanitarian. And I think he treated his people well. He respected, his drovers. He understood the animals. I think he did. And that's why we played them up in the show, because we had this sense that he could not have accomplished what he did without the help of those people. I suspect he was a really good manager.
I was impressed by the quote that Jonathan mentioned after the Battle of Trenton, where he says, here's a man who has embarked on warfare, and yet he says any man who lives by warfare will receive their just demerits in another world. I was struck by that he recognized that this was necessary, but that you lose something in the process.
Yeah.
When they got to Dorchester, I was under the impression that it was a big surprise to the British. Can you speak to how they actually surprised? They did more work in like 1 or 2 nights than I think a British General Howe had said something to that effect of how they all set up and surprised everybody.
So the question was, how were it was a surprise to the British that the guns had arrived and were then set up on Dorchester Heights. How did they do that? And why didn't the British know?
It was dead of night. They did it dead of night. The photographs that I did of World's End, which is a coastal drumlin in a storm on March 17th. It was. I don't think it was necessarily inhabited, So, in the dead of night, and they had already constructed the barricades, so it all happened overnight, and the British woke up and said, "Oh my God, we're surrounded." And I would assume they still left cannon at Roxbury, and they still had cannon at Cobble Hill and
So they
Beechmere
worked
as
all
well.
night.
But they were surrounded. And one of the information I've always carried is that they couldn't maneuver their ships, and they realized they were screwed. And given Bunker Hill and their experience and their losses on Bunker Hill, they couldn't even imagine a ground invasion because they would have been creamed in a ground invasion. So that combination of factors, the funny thing is that some of the cannon were decoys. Yep.
What about the actual battle? In other words, was any ship sunk? There they have these.
So the question was there a battle and were any ships sunk? You want?
I can't answer it. I don't believe there were.
So my understanding is no, there was no battle. The Continental Army did fire some volleys of cannon into Boston on March 2nd, 3rd, 4th, kind of saying, "Hey, we're here. We've got the cannons." The British tried to fire back, but they, as Jonathan said, couldn't get their cannons elevated enough, and they couldn't. They tried to mount a counterattack against Dorchester Heights, but they couldn't get their fleet there because of the storm. And by that point, they realized they're going to leave. The British general sent a letter to General Washington saying, "We will leave Boston as long as you don't, and we won't burn the city as long as you don't fire on us as we're on our way out."
As we're leaving.
General Washington, interestingly enough, got the letter but refused to officially accept the letter because it was not addressed to him as the commander of the Continental Army. The British refused to recognize these traitors. So he refused to accept their letter, but he knew the contents of the letter. And so they had this kind of game where they didn't talk to each other, but they got the word back to the British saying, "Okay, we won't fire on you as you go out." And they did not burn Boston.
So they just left and
there
that
was
was it?
no battle. It was a... They realized they were, the British realized they were in a position they could not win, and so they left.
They went to Halifax. They left Boston for Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Speaking to the British not knowing, in my head I have a certain sense that there was an arrogance there about these little people who are, and not, maybe they did hear all about this. And some 26-year-old who's doing it, it's like, yeah, well, that's never, there's a certain amount of, oh well, they can do what they think they can do, but it's not going to bother us. And I don't know. That has had to have played it.
So the comment is that there was a certain arrogance on the part of the British that the Continental Army was a bunch of rabble that really couldn't effectuate this, and even if they heard about it, they kind of dismissed it. Is that?
That's my, what do I know? Nothing, but I just feel like, yeah, that's happened before.
From what I've read, I think you're right. I think there was that perception that the British expected that this rabble could not possibly defeat the British Army. But it also begs the question of did they actually know that the cannons were there? And from what I've read, again, is that no, they did not know. Somehow, there were no British Army forces between Ticonderoga and Boston. So there were lots of loyalists. Why didn't they get word to Boston? But apparently they did not, and did not know for the month and a half between the cannons arriving in Framingham and being emplaced on Dorchester Heights, apparently did not know that they were there. And so March 2nd, they wake up And here are these cannons looming over them. From what I've read, they were caught unawares. They did not know it. So there was maybe this arrogance, and I would agree with you, but I think there was legitimate lack of knowledge. They did not realize it.
I think one thing to add is, and it's a meaning that I think has been sort of glossed over the years, and it's something that the Ken Burns first few segments really made clear, was the level of violence was hand to hand. And the level of violence was really a horror, both to the colonists as well as to the British. And there was this one piece of art, and there's a poem that goes with the piece of art that we put over the image of Bunker Hill, that was all the coffins. They suffered real losses at war, and I think that Hal just decided, we're going to get creamed. This is not for us. We got to go. And whatever arrogance they had was real, but I think there was also a fear factor that they suffered all these losses, and do we want to sustain, or are we beat? And the colonists, they were tar and feathering people. That was their most severe weapon, and that was killing people. That was parading people through the streets. That's what that was about. So I think the British said, "Oh my God, we've had it." I think that's what happened.
Okay, a couple more questions. Richard?
Just to follow up on the question about British arrogance, indeed, that may have been the case, and it was a magnificent performance that freed New England. But 3 months later, the largest fleet in the Western world to that time, into New York Harbor. And that began the real the 5 years of war.
Right. The war went on. It did not end in '76.
Okay, another question?
I had a question related to the questions you were just answering. So different towns, I think at the time, some were more loyalist and some less so. Along the trail, were these kind of majority revolutionary towns, or were they, do we know the fraction of the population that was loyalist?
Well, my understanding is that there were people in all these towns who did not welcome the revolution because everything was okay. They were okay. They had their property. But Shays' Rebellion, happened next door, and people were saying, well, wait a minute. Is it right for you to be taking from us when you have no part in our day-to-day lives? So I think that there were loyalists all along the way who wanted to return, even the Indians, they wanted to return to the peaceful coexistence, because there had been peaceful coexistence until the British started doing things that got people's rile up.
So, and again, from what I've read, there were certainly a high proportion of patriots who were pro-independence. There was a smaller proportion of loyalists, and then there was a big group in the middle that we're okay with the status quo. Let's get this over with and get back to our lives. But I think the loyalists were in the minority. But there certainly were loyalists along the route. There were some documented, certainly in Great Barrington and along the way. But again, the question of how did they get through here? Why is there not more documentation about it? Did people not notice a 4-mile-long column of sleds and things going through? This was in the middle of the winter. They certainly were not trying to advertise their existence, but you can't miss that kind of a procession, if you will. But so it's surprising to me that the word did not get to Boston, apparently, or if it did, they certainly did. The British did not act on it.
You mentioned that this was shown in many schools using the old technology. Do you think this new technology of today will allow it to be distributed more widely and really?
So the question is, with the distribution of the technology to educate people in schools and the education system today, as compared to it was 50 years ago, is that accurate? Jonathan?
Well, and is your question about this show?
Yes. Yes.
Here we are. You are the perfect audience. Somebody in this room is involved with the local school district. You want to show the show, show the show. you know, it's a frustration of mine that, and thank you, Ed, for opening the topic, but a year and a half ago I went to the state and I said, I got this asset, out with the old, in with the new. So the state didn't pick up on the fact that this show existed nor what it was. They've seen it because I sent it. Terrific was the response I got. Same with Rev 250. I'm sorry. Same thing. I have zero explanation. Should it, could it be shown? Of course. Could I lop off the contemporary sequence and just make it a history piece? Of course I could. I need to be asked to do it. I need, you know, I know that it's being shown today in Springfield Armory. It's appropriate, but I'm not sure it's for me to make that happen.
So the hope is that, yes, this will be widely available, and we hope to get the word out. A part of the grant that paid for the production costs came from Housatonic Heritage, National Heritage Area. They've posted it on their YouTube page. I talked to Dan Bolognani a couple of days ago, and he said it's getting a lot of hits. So the word is getting out there. We hope to get this documentary seen by everybody who wants to see it, and hopefully, particularly in schools. So
I put it up on the Russell
I put
page.
that message back all to you. Spread the word. We'd like this documentary to be seen by as many people as possible.
I've been invited to the Pioneer Valley History Network offsite in April as a keynote to show the show. They're interested in local history, but it'll also be an undergraduate audience, so they'll be very interested in the photography piece of it and the production piece of it, which I'm assuming they're going to ask that I talk about more than I have today.
Okay, one more question.
Quick one. One of the teamsters that was hired on the trip, on the journey, was a young boy, 14 or 15, who kept a diary. I don't remember the name, but are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's why we have that young kid that you see in the show, but I don't know anything about the story.
So the question was about the young teamster who was on the Knox. His name is John Becker.
Okay.
He was the son of the head teamster that was hired in Saratoga, and he kept a journal, and 50 years later, he wrote a book that he recorded some of the stories. So some of the stories that we know, such as Westfield, the celebration in Westfield, come from his book. Unfortunately, he doesn't mention a word about crossing the Berkshires. But you know, we're happy for anything we get.
I just want to respond one more time. You know, it is what it is. And do we want to watch a slideshow in the 21st century for 21 minutes? So it is what it is. And that's why I preface by saying you're the right audience, and I think it's the right audience at an event. I can see, you know, I put it up on Vimeo, and you can watch it on Vimeo. That's a streaming site. That's an adaptive streaming site, so it sees your equipment and it marries your equipment with what it streams to you. It's a very effective, very popular site. I can see in the viewership where it drops off. That opening historical sequence loses half the audience. They don't even watch. They don't even get beyond. You can literally can see the graph, and then people stay with the show to the end. So it's a matter of expectation. You knew you were coming to see this. It's a matter of expectation and setting the appropriate expectation.
Okay, final question.
I was just going to ask where the Fuller House is in Westfield, because I just tried to look that up. I don't know.
Their name was Fuller.
Okay.
I don't know where it is. Their name, and you know, Mrs. Barton from Otis, who you saw photographed in her home, she is an Otis. I would simply ask town representatives, who could I go find? Tony Lincoln was Brookfield Orchard. I was just sort of directed to people who might have an interest in participating. The people doing the chicken kill. I mean, I didn't know them. I was directed to them. Same with the Fullers.
Okay, thank you very much.